start. All right. So, there we go. Quick bit of information for the remainder of the semester. We've got 2 weeks left, more or less. Why is it zoomed in so much? So here's today, and here is Thanksgiving break. We've got this week, next week, and then like the next Monday. And the reason why that's important is we only have 1 day after that before the finals. So, in other words, we are unfortunately in the unpleasant position that I often find myself in this class. We don't quite have enough time for a third test because we would still have to do the review and then do the test and then try to, like, even if we did the review today, which we can't because we haven't even done the last chapter, and if the test was on Wednesday, we'd only have 3 days left to do anything. And unless I did like a chapter a day, which I could technically do, but nobody would want that, we wouldn't have time. So, long story short, we're going to do like I often do, and test 3 is going to be the final. As I've said, the final is never any different than from the test. It's 50 questions, multiple choice, short answer, extra credit at the end. The only difference for this one, because as I've said, I'm going to go ahead and put on Chapter 10 as well as 7, 8, and 9. While it will technically be going over more information, as you will see in the study guide once we get to that, it's less information per chapter. So there's not as much like nitpicky stuff. I go over like one big event and then move to the next. So for the most part, that's that. Unfortunately, we are quite far ahead in this class, and I'm going to have to figure out what to do once we do finish Chapter 10, because I don't see Chapter 10 taking 2 weeks. I'll just find stuff for us to watch, I guess. Also of importance, the second paper is due in 2 weeks. As I mentioned, it's due on the, I don't have it here, what is that, 25th of November? So it's 2 weeks from today. I suppose next time I need to make the first paper due a little bit sooner so that there's more of a gap, but November being short on both ends, us having fall break up here and then Thanksgiving break down here, it cuts like an entire week out. So that doesn't leave us with a lot of time. So the second paper is due here. Again, the default topic, let me make sure that this is running properly because I'm yapping. Okay, the default topic is basically the high watermark of the Middle Ages, just something in the Middle Ages that you saw as positive, because we are about to get into the very negative part of the Middle Ages, which is what people remembered in the Renaissance. Or just like just an event in the Middle Ages or a person in the Middle Ages that you find interesting. Obviously, if you want to do something besides that, you've got literally from Rome until the Renaissance, if you want to go beyond even what we're doing. So lots of time, lots of real important stuff happening. So you're more than welcome to expand beyond the default. Again, if you've done, if you're happy with your test grades and did the first paper, you can technically skip the second paper, and then I'll drop that. But if you want to make sure that you've got that extra cushion going into the final, you can do that as well. This class isn't as big as some of my other ones, so I'm not too worried about having a bunch of papers to grade for you guys. But again, it's up to you. I mean, at least for you folks here in person, you've done really well so far, so you could probably afford to skip that second paper. So yeah. Oh, also, I should further mention. There we go. This being the last day of class, that will be our review day, and then I don't remember exactly when our final is. I'll look it up between now and then. Obviously, you guys might have gotten it via email. If not, I've got it. It's just back in my email somewhere. But yeah, I mean, that's it. The review will be December 2nd. Final will be sometime in this period. For you guys, just come in at, for you guys it'll be a little bit different because it'll be at 8:30. All the exams are at 8:30. It's 8:30 to 10:30, so you have 2 hours. You will not need 2 hours. For you online folks, I will put it up probably at the beginning of the finals week, but you have to have it done by that next week. I cannot extend it because that next day is when grades are due, and that's it. I'm done. I can't do any more. So for you folks online, do the test as soon as you can. Other than that, that's all I can think. Any questions from you folks about anything? Okay, so let me go ahead and get that back down because it's not on my main screen. Oops, what are you doing? Quit. Oh, that's why it's doing that. All right. So, back to this. So we started we started chapter 10. We only got a couple slides in. I mean, this is slide 4, and the first one is the title. So, we do, however, we're having bad weather and famines, and some really even some problems within the church, which for a society that is built around the church, not great. The Avignon papacy, where the Pope Clement V chose the King of France and moved the papacy to Avignon, which, I mean, to be fair, Avignon is a nice place, but it's not the Papal Palace, which here we have the Avignon Papal Palace. And then also the Knights Templar were destroyed at the behest of Philip because they didn't want to pay his debts back. And so the Pope, who was nominally in charge of the Knights, basically threw them to the wolves because his buddy Philip told him to. So, of course, Templars. And they are still technically around today. They're just a bunch of weird old men in robes. As I've said, it's very similar to, the Masons or what are some of the other ones? The Illuminati doesn't exist. The Freemasons, groups that are basically these little secret societies, which I've known people in the Masons, and I mean, granted they were weird, but it was more them than the fact they were in the Masons. It was just like a secret club. It's just a club you go to with your buddies and like hang out. It's not as nefarious as weirdo conspiracy theorists make it seem. And then, of course, but hey, sometimes you get a big hat. I can see conspiracy theorists get jealous of that. So, this is where we would have gotten last time, but I wanted to make sure we didn't go too long. So we've got the Holy Roman Emperor. I mean, this has been passed down since Charlemagne. But at this time, the Holy Roman Emperor was elected from a group of nobles and very rarely had a dynastic line. So when the Holy Roman Emperor died, someone else was elected in his place rather than, his son taking over. And rather than it being like this grand office that you would want to be elected to, the rival German princes would put someone especially weak in power, so that the Holy Roman Emperor would not be a position of strength. Because even if you're put in a position of strength when you're someone, when they say a weak competitor, that means they don't have a lot of land, they don't have a lot of military, and above all else, they don't command a lot of authority, so nobody really listens to them anyway. So just because they get a new fancy hat doesn't mean they are automatically, everyone's automatically loyal to them. Also, the emperor had to deal with Italian affairs, which is to say the papacy. And while this didn't directly affect the Holy Roman Empire, it still was a lot of work for the Holy Roman Emperor. So it just wasn't great. Being the Holy Roman Emperor kind of sucked. Until we get Charles IV of Bohemia. He issued the Golden Bull. A bull at the time was a word for like an edict, typically put out by a pope. But because of the, I guess you'd say the elevated role of the Holy Roman Emperor, their edicts were also called bulls. Because, I mean, he's the Holy Roman Emperor. You're clearly got some amount of church authority. Basically, the Golden Bull was used to straighten out all of this. Where's my mouse? All of this where they were specifically kept weak. He created a lively court culture, brought a bunch of luminary and visionary thinkers from across Europe. So he almost restored what Charlemagne had at the start. He had an intelligent court. He had a vigorous culture. He, again, made it so that the Holy Roman Emperor wouldn't just be this paper tiger that nobody liked or nobody respected, I should say. It doesn't matter whether you like them, you got to respect them. So yeah, this guy almost returned the Holy Roman Empire to what it had been before. But obviously, once he was gone, it sort of went back downhill. But it was still better than it was. This is the Golden Bull, so called because the stamp that was used to represent, I already lost his name, Charles's authority, was gold. That's why it's called the Golden Bull. Usually this was just like a wax stamp that was affixed to it, but he decided to go a little extra fancy. The Golden Bull is not the golden calf. That's a completely different. That's a completely different thing. So, the 100 Years' War didn't last 100 years. There was actually a bunch of little wars that occurred over a course of 116 years, but it was between the same two people over largely the same thing, so it's just considered one big-ass war. So the main reason for this were claims made by England on the continent, as we mentioned way back when William the Conqueror took over England. His main base of power was in Normandy, which, if you're not familiar, is in northern France. And as we've seen through Henry and Richard, despite the fact that they were kings of England, they largely ruled from Normandy. So eventually there was this, I don't remember who actually pushed first. It might have been France wanting, their territory to be contiguous and not have this little plot of land that was taken by the English, or if the English were actually pushing out of this plot of land to try to take more territory. Either way, there were a couple of small skirmishes over what England had, and especially areas that were really good for shipping or agriculture. Of course, it was about money. There was also the issue of secession, because once again, who rightfully is supposed to be on the throne causes a whole freaking war. Charles IV died without leaving an heir, so King Edward III of England was like, well, technically I'm the Duke of Normandy, so I am part of the French kingdom, and therefore I also have claim for the French throne. The French politely told him where he could stick it and crowned Philip VI of Valois king. So within, 9 years here, 1337, Edward launched an invasion of France. And obviously, with a war that lasts over 100 years, there were multiple phases to it. So the first phase was, long story short, major victories for England across the board. France's population was triple that of England, but, well, the English were just better at fighting. Better tactics, better technology. They would either pay a town to submit, or if they didn't, they would starve them out. By 1346, Edward was outside the walls of Paris. Bleh. So, yeah, 1337 to 1346, yeah, that's another 9 years, but in a medieval war, that's pretty quick. So, there was a major battle at Crécy. Crécy, I don't know, French. So rather than it being like two lines of dudes just crashing together in the middle and see who wins, the British not the British, sorry, I have the British written here, they're not British yet. The English surrounded the French on three sides and mostly had crossbows. Longbows. The French had crossbows, which are strong, but have nowhere near the range of a longbow. Because a crossbow is largely for, like, really close range engagements, whereas with longbows, you get a bunch of dudes line up, and they can arc them in the air, and they just rain down on the other side. The French were torn to pieces. There is a... Do I have it here? No. So there is a particular event in this battle that is long remembered on both sides. And even like modern day, I hear, especially like British folks, casually commenting on it. So there was a French noble who was so old that he had to be tied to his saddle because he couldn't sit up in the saddle. And he was also blind, or mostly blind, so he had to have two of his vassals tie their horses to his horse and guide him where they were going. And because French, he believed this would be a glorious battle and they would easily defeat the English and all would be well. So there is this infamous line where he stated, "Ride me closer so that I might hit them with my sword." So his vassals led him and his horse into the English lines, and after the battle he was found still tied to his horse, still tied to his vassals, and full of arrows. So a lot of times, it's just kind of a a little thing people say when they want to do something foolish is, "Ride me closer." I want to hit them with my sword. Crecy was not the end of the war, because, I mean, it's the 100 Years' War, not the 9 Years' War. In 1356, there was a two-pronged English assault. One prong was led by Edward, Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales is the term for the next in line for the crown. He was also called the Black Prince. We're not sure why. We don't know if maybe his armor was darker or he had like a black banner. But either way, that was the nickname that he was given. And fought against a much larger French force at Poitiers. Not only was Edward victorious, but they captured King John II, who was the new King of France, which led to the Treaty of Burgundy in 1360 that ransomed the John back to the French and gave England a bunch of land in northern France. Again, not technically the end of the war, but at least the end of this phase. The book specifically mentions... Actually, no, I'll get to that in a second. It's the next slide. I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we have Crecy. Again, obviously, medieval art is very, very accurate, and this is the ideal engagement range for crossbows and longbows, while the actual like cavalry and infantry is in the back. I don't know what that's about. So, chivalry. This comes from the French word cheval, which means horse. So a chevalier is a horseman or knight. So this is the proper behavior of a knight. This defined the kind of conduct that was expected. I mean, again, this changed over the course of the Middle Ages. Early in the Middle Ages, knights were just hired thugs, or just glorified robbers. They could go in and burn down villages and steal stuff from people and assault peasants, because they could. To glorious crusaders, as we saw throughout the Crusades, especially, like Richard the Lionheart. And then finally, the noble gentlemen and spiritual strivers that are often thought about today. This was something that was mentioned in the book as, well, I'll just go ahead and read this. On the evening after the Battle of Poitiers, the Black Prince wined and dined the captured French king and his knights. The prince himself served the French at their own high table, refused to sit with King John, not because it was his prisoner, because he was so distinguished. The Black Prince, full of courtesy and flowery French, told the king not to despair. He had acted with great skill and bravery in battle, and Edward's father would surely treat him with friendship and honor, as far as circumstances would allow. So this was the ideal of chivalry. It wasn't really a thing. By the 1320s, we had cannons and gunpowder, so dudes on horseback with armor didn't last especially long. And even before that, longbows and crossbows really equalized the playing field. Because if you're riding across the field on your horse, and you've got your lance up or whatever weapon you're carrying, and about 12 to 30 arrows hit you in the face and chest, you're not coming out of that. And also, even before, or even not dealing with longbows and crossbows, just the infantry that were mostly used by the English, because again, the French were more set in the old ways. If you have a bunch of dudes charging at you on horseback, if you and a bunch of other guys line up and you have big pointy sticks, the cavalry charge isn't going to go well. So eventually, the French also abandoned this idea of chivalry is similar to the samurai code of Bushido, which you may also be familiar with. It never existed. It wasn't real. It was made up after the samurai became less important in Japanese society, so that, well, less important in battle because, again, they had gunpowder and arrows and whatnot, and so, like, peasants could fight. So once samurai weren't as important on the battlefield, they made up this whole Bushido thing to make them seem more important and honorable than the fact that they were just like knights, thugs, or glorified robbers that did whatever they wanted because they were above the law. So it's an interesting parallel. You know, a lot of times people compare knights and samurai, and it wasn't just because they were dudes with swords that, you know, fought in battles. They also were having to make up new things once they became less important. Though that actually doesn't come until like the 1800s with the Meiji Restoration, but we'll get to that later. That we'll literally talk about that next semester. Here is the most ridiculous knight image I could find. Obviously, nobody wore this into battle. This is maybe like ceremonial armor, or more than likely something that never actually existed. I also found this, and I don't actually even remember where it comes from, but I thought it was funny. So there's the thing that exists. I don't have anything else for chivalry? No. We are going to get into the Black Death. This is going to take probably most of the rest of the class today. This is a long thing. Yersinia pestis. That's the name of the bacteria that caused the Black Death. As we mentioned, the plague, well, killed a lot of folks in Europe, and those that were left weak. Their immune systems weren't very strong. And also, they hadn't dealt with the bubonic plague in like 600 years. We mentioned it back in, what chapter was it? Chapter 6? Yeah, it was chapter 6, because that was right before the last test. With, Constantinople. That was 600 years ago. So by the time the Black Death came back, nobody was immune to it anymore, or at least nobody was resistant to it. I shouldn't say immune. Which I'll talk about, like, plague immunity here in a little bit. It was also considered a pandemic, larger than an epidemic, spread over 1 million regions, communicable between the infected, and had a very high mortality. And yeah, substantial mortality. I mean, again, modern day pandemic, people are like, oh, it only had like a 1% to 2% mortality rate. It's like, yeah, but if, say, 30 million people get it, then, 30,000, or no, 300,000 people are going to die. Like, what are you even going on about? Yeah, so even a small percentage of just like you're dead mortality is very, very high. This one was far worse. Obviously, large centers of population allowed for the disease to spread more quickly and kill many, many more people. Originally from Asia, we've got reports of this disease tearing through Asia, in particular, like, the Mongolians they would literally take people who had died of the plague and launch their bodies into cities as basically, biological warfare. Because if you're already in a city that's being sieged, the disease is going to be a problem. But if the dudes that are doing the siege are launching bodies full of plague into the city, that's going to make it much worse. Also, just, the morale hit that's going to cause when dead bodies are flying in the city. Anyway, it killed about 30 million people in China before riding into Italy on ships. Now, I mentioned here fleas on rats. That's not entirely correct. Some relatively recent, and I'll show the video at the end, some relatively recent studies have shown that during the time that the plague was happening in China, it was, I don't remember whether it was a really dry period or a really wet period. It was one or the other, and it was the one that rats aren't actually that fond of. But there's another rodent that's wild to China that liked the kind of weather that was happening and was largely exploding in population, and that was gerbils. Gerbils are wild in China and are very likely the ones who managed to get aboard ships. Because, I mean, gerbils are still rodents. They still do the same thing as rats do if they're left out to do their own thing. So they got aboard ships, made it back to Italy in 1347. Now, pretty quickly, the Italians were like, oh, something bad is happening. We need to quarantine the ships. Quarantine literally means 40 days. That's what quarantine means. You can tell from like literally the first part of the word. Quar. However, there's an issue with quarantining ships in the harbor. They still have to be tied to the dock, and rodents are really good at going across ropes. A lot of in fact, the Dark Ages documentary that I have shown you guys bits and pieces of has a thing on the Black Death, and very specifically shows like rats going across the rope. So, again, if a rat can do it, a gerbil can do it. The cities were soon besieged by the plague, and then began making its way up the continent. It moved 5 to 10 miles a day, which for a disease is insane, especially at a time when they didn't have, air travel or road travel, not, real road travel. But the disease moved very, very quickly. The book also mentions that the Islamic lands were also affected, because, they're closer to China, but also they're still trading with the rest of the world. So there's aspects of that in the book. Let's see, 13 to 30 million people in late Yuan China. About 40 million people were killed throughout the Islamic world. 100 people a day were dying in Damascus in June of 1348. So that was a whole thing. We'll get to that a little bit later as well. So there are three main types of the plague. The bubonic plague, which is often just a shorthand for the Black Death in general, transmitted by the fleas. These cause buboes, or swelling of lymph nodes, so big swellings on your arm, on your neck, armpits, groins, etc. It lasted about a week, and you pretty much was a coin flip whether you'd survive or not. 50 to 60% mortality rate. That was the best case scenario. There's also the pneumonic plague, transmitted from people to people by air and on surfaces, so a lot like the common cold. I'll see y'all on Wednesday. It was less common because it killed so quickly. It had a 95 to 100% mortality rate, and only incubated for 3 days. So it hit you quick, and it killed you quick, which in a way was better for everybody else because you weren't around to spread it as long. Whereas with the bubonic plague, if you already had it and you got bitten by fleas and they jumped off you, they would further spread it. With this, it lasted a lot shorter, and again, people weren't traveling as much. So it's not like today where you can go from city to city and just spread the thing. But it very, very quickly killed you, and you had a very small chance of surviving. But then there's the other one, the septicemic plague, which again, if you're familiar at all with like Latin, that means like of the blood. this was the bacterium directly infecting the bloodstream. So oftentimes if someone was sick and they had an open wound and that blood got into your blood because you had an open wound, and again, it's the Middle Ages, so people are going around with open wounds all the time. Where the bacterium directly gets into your blood, it just you were dead. You didn't last very long at all. We really have only been able to figure this out due to, in part, some records of the time, but also like studying the bones of the deceased from this period. A lot of I wouldn't say the disease stays in the bone, but evidence of the disease stays in the bone. And we were able to figure out that it wasn't just bubonic, but other forms. And this is all still technically the same disease. Yersinia pestis is a bacterial infection. It still exists today. I mean, it's still around. It causes these awful swellings. But it's bacterial. It's not that hard to get rid of with modern medicine. You literally take an antibacterial medicine and it largely gets rid of it. It's still horribly unpleasant. But it happens sometimes. It's still around. It's not like, smallpox, which has been technically eradicated, but they've still got it in like a lab underground somewhere in case it does get out and they need to like make a vaccine. This is still around, in part, again, because it's possible to get rid of it. Again, it's bacterial, so it's not that big of a deal. But also, it's hard to like wipe out just bacteria. They're everywhere. All right, let's get a little bit more into Yersinia pestis. 1348, all major port cities in Italy had the plague, and as I mentioned, it jumped to the mainland and began moving north. Many cities lost half their population over the course of about 6 months, which again, like that little piece we saw on the Justinian plague, I mean, just imagine like half the people are dead within half a year. Like, what do you even do with that? And as, again, mentioned in that previous video on a previous example of the bubonic plague, there weren't enough people in the cities to bury the ones that were dead. Like, they just had to leave the bodies out because there wasn't anybody to actually bury them. The people that were still alive typically were horribly weakened because they had gotten the disease. It was hard not to get the disease, but managed to survive. But even if you survive, it doesn't mean that everything's great. I mean, I got all COVID, and clearly I survived, but it still has weakened me pretty significantly. My health is not what it used to be, and also I get the old brain fog, which makes teaching difficult. But you do what you do. As winter rolled around, the disease slowed because the fleas and rats, or gerbils, whichever, typically weren't moving around as much. They were finding a warm place to stay. But by the time we got into 1349, it was back and moving just as quickly as before. The initial outbreak of the Black Death killed about 30 to 40% of Europe's population. That's about 30 million people at a time when, well, obviously 30 to 40%, they had, maybe 80, 90 million? That was substantial. And this is something that I could talk about for a very long time. The cultural impact of this is hard to overstate. I mean, it was the Middle Ages, so already there was this idea that at any moment you could die, which is why the church was so important and why people were, they would defer to church authority over secular authority because, hey, I'm only going to live here a couple of decades, but once I die, I better make sure I go to the right place. But they had never seen death like this before. And it really messed with a lot of people. The art from the period was crazy. I mean, this is just hell. This is just actually this was also when death was depicted as like walking skeletons. Also when we got the first. Do I have a picture of him? Well, here's people dying in. It looks like we're back in Constantinople again. That's a more Roman-looking city. Yeah. Again, this idea of just like the dancing dead, people are dying so quickly, it's like they never even were gone. And also where the modern interpretation of the Grim Reaper came from. Because, again, people were just falling like wheat before the scythe, as it were. It was a major impact, not just on the fact that it killed half of Europe, but the people that survived were forever scarred, both physically and mentally. Already got ahead of myself. So many have died that many people were not buried because there weren't enough people to even dig the graves. And the people who died in the largest numbers were doctors and gravediggers because they were the ones who were either there with the dying or the dead. And if you're not familiar with handling dead animals, once the body starts going cold, the fleas start evacuating. So, you would think, yeah, a doctor who's dealing with people who are sick and dying would certainly just get the disease more. But the people who are actually like burying the bodies are also dealing with the fact that the bodies are going cold and the fleas are looking for something else warm to latch onto and have a meal, and you're the closest. I've buried a few pets, and especially the ones that were like outside animals, the fleas immediately start leaving once the body gets cold. The morals of Europe also broke down. Why not do everything you can today because you may die tomorrow? Familial bonds broke down. Husbands and wives would abandon each other and their children, escaping the cities to try to save themselves. Which, not great, but in a way probably the best idea because if you're away from large population centers, you're probably going to be a bit more safe. Abandoning your kids isn't great, but, well, we'll see here in just a little bit. And also the church trying to use the power that they had to provide aid to the victims was not enough. We've talked in the last 3 chapters about how the church got more and more powerful and how it basically ran Europe. But this pandemic, this event was so incredible, so just beyond anyone's imagining, that not even the church could handle it. Not even the church had the money or the power or the manpower to just help the people who were dying. Also, a couple of, I just want to throw this one in here for the plague doctor. If you're familiar with, if you know what this image is, you know what the image is, but don't worry about it. So the stereotypical plague doctor outfit, while the idea was, the design is from a misunderstanding of how disease works, obviously. But it still did kind of help them because they had full body coverings, they had this mask on, so essentially, excuse me, and also gloves. Essentially no bit of skin would be exposed. So, and they also would have these like poking sticks. They would often not get in direct contact with victims. So, in a way, it helped protect them. It certainly wasn't foolproof, but it was a measure that worked better than it should have. It's similar to what you would see in the Civil War. The thread they used for stitches was horsehair that they would boil to get the curliness out of them, because horses tend to have at least some level of curl to their manes. But by boiling the hair, they inadvertently also burned off the diseases that were on the horsehair. And so during the Civil War, when disease killed way more people than the actual war, this accidental sterilization of what they were using as thread saved a lot of people. So this was another sort of, they sort of accidentally did the right thing. Obviously, the most telling part of this is the mask with this big funky beak here. Do you know what the beak was used for?
They would put herbs and spices in it to try and protect them.
Right.
But the thing that actually protected them was their wax-covered clothing.
Right.
Because fleas couldn't jump on them.
I didn't realize they were covered in wax, but that makes sense.
That's what I heard.
That makes sense. That's something they certainly could get their hands on. Not it wasn't some foreign thing. Wax just being congealed animal fat. Yeah, they would put in herbs, lavender often in here, because the belief was that disease came not from, well, in this case especially the fleas, but from, quote, miasma or unclean air, which again, not entirely untrue for like the pneumonic part of it, the diseases that travel through the air, but their idea was like when a body's rotting and it smells, that's what gets you sick, is this bad air. So again, they weren't right in what they thought, but what they did to prevent it ended up helping to some degree. So yeah, the big weird beaks would often be filled with things that smell good, so they don't smell the dead bodies. All right. Responses to the plague, which as you can tell from the title there, we've got a couple of them. So if you survived the plague, you were now immune, or at least resistant to the plague, because again, it's a bacterial infection. Bacteria doesn't rapidly evolve like viruses do. So if you get it and you survive it, you're pretty much done. Your body knows how to fight it off. You can technically, again, you can still get it, but your body is right on top of it, and it's not a problem. Which is good, because this wasn't the only time the Black Death hit Europe. As I said, it still exists today, and back then it would come back every 10 or so years. Now, that was all well and good for the people who got the plague and survived it, but it's not something that you can pass on to your kids. So when the disease came back every 10 or so years, we had a new crop of kids, and you lost about half of them. This actually resulted in the European population not growing until about the 1600s. So for the next 300 years or so, the population would more or less stay the same. You would obviously get people, you get more people, but then every 10 years, a bunch of them would get wiped out, and then the older people who had the immunity would die just of natural causes. So the population in Europe kind of stayed around the same for a couple of hundred years. That was how bad this disease had a hold on Europe. A sort of positive thing, it's hard to really look at that, but because Europe no longer had an overpopulation problem, there was a lot of land now for the people who were still around. Obviously, if the people owning the land are dead, nobody can claim it, so more people were able to get land. But more importantly, workers could charge more for their labor because, once again, there were far less people to do the labor, and if you need labor done and you've only got a couple of guys left and they want you to pay them more than they would have been paid when there was a lot more people to choose from, there's not much you can do. So this actually ended up weakening nobility to some degree, because commoners, this was, anybody that knows the economy would probably hit me for saying this, because this is a really, really oversimplified analogy. But it's like the commoners in general had sort of formed a union. They had come together and decided, hey, there's not that many of us left. We should be paid more than what we've been getting paid, and if you don't pay us, we'll just not work for you. And so the nobles had to make some concessions to the commoners. Of course, the nobility weren't real keen on that. They tried to return things to the way they were by fixing prices to what they had been before the plague, which resulted in lots of brutal riots. Now, I've mentioned briefly about how peasant riots weren't just like, oh, they were big, protests or even, riots where they burned stuff. There were a lot of peasants, and they were really mad. And, well, let's see. An uprising in France called the Jacquerie, which is actually named after, let's see, what do we have here? Named after the caricature of a good peasant, Jacques Bonhomme, or Jack the Good Guy, began attacking their lords, pillaging, raping, and roasting them alive. French aristocrats were shocked since they had believed that coercive power was their divine right, not that of their inferiors. Well, the Jacquerie proved them wrong. There were uprisings in England as well as in Italy with similar outcomes. Let's see. 3 times between 1371 and 1381, the English king had imposed a poll or head tax. The last was Spartan rebellion, yada, 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 led to resistance, questioned the very authority of their lords. Their motto was, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Which is to say, like when creation began, who was considered the nobility that everyone had to listen to? We're all the same. Questioned arbitrary and unnatural nature of social classes. Had some success, but almost as violent. They were almost as violent as the aristocratic oppressors. Murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. Oh, hey, that guy's not doing that's a bad job. And of course, the rebellions that did happen were violently suppressed. So while they were very much going around and murdering and roasting nobles, once the nobility got together, they were the army, and no amount of an uprising typically can handle the army going against them. Which, as we'll see next semester going into the French Revolution, it's when the army joins the rebellion that things are very much over for those they're rebelling against. Towns recovered faster than the countryside. People were willing to go into towns to earn more money, as opposed to going to live in the countryside where, well, you didn't make much at all. Also, there was even like an economic shift. Farmers were more willing, no, sorry, got ahead of myself. Because you weren't sure if the plague was going to come through again and wipe everything out, people were a bit more adventurous in their investments. So in Germany, more iron and, well, I was going to say coal, but that's not a thing yet. More mines were being opened in Germany, which led to an economic boom for Germany, at least. So, while the plague was certainly the worst thing, there was some benefit to it. The the church also had a certain response to all of this because of their emphasis on communal living. Obviously, monasteries and whatnot were hit very hard. People all living together in a small space, and you get something like this come through, that's it for them. Also, once again, like with the doctors, priests would typically be the ones that would be administering sacraments to the dead and to the sick and dying, not the dead and dying, the sick and dying. So they, of course, would often fall ill and die not long after. It got so bad that the Bishop of Bath and Wells, these are cities in England, permitted laymen and laywomen to hear the confessions of the dying and administer sacraments. So, again, in Catholic tradition, you're supposed to confess your sins to make sure that you've got a clean conscience and have sacraments administered, which I'm not even entirely sure what that is. That's part of the Catholic tradition. And obviously, you're supposed to have a priest do that. They're the ones that are, in the service of God doing all that. But so many people were dying so quickly, and so many priests were already dead, that in these cities, regular folks could hear confessions and administer sacraments, because they just literally couldn't get to everybody. There were some other groups that happened. The Flagellants. This was a religious group that went through towns and in the countryside, whipping themselves to atone for the sins that brought the plague. Now, this wasn't great, because they would, be going through these city centers, whipping themselves and tearing off chunks of flesh and slinging it everywhere, which spread the disease more. This is probably where the septicemic stuff came from, because people were just flinging bits of themselves all over the place. Because, again, a whip isn't just like a horse whip where it's just a piece of leather. These were cat o' nine tails. These were things with glass and metal bits and stuff in the ends of things, so they just hit themselves and just tear off. It was, not great. Not at all sanitary. There was also a shift in the view of religion. Many people wanted a more personal version, returning to a more simpler age of Christianity, as opposed to what we had, excuse me, what we had with Catholicism, with all the big churches and everything's gold-plated and all of that. So the Catholic Church was weakened on a number of fronts during this. And it wasn't just because, everybody was dying, or you had these crazies roaming around. But some people were just like, hey, being dead is kind of a personal thing. Maybe we don't need all of this show and grandeur and whatnot of the High Catholic Church. There we have the Flagellants. They often wore these big, tall hats. There's a game recently that came out where your character is basically dressed like a flagellant. I think it's Blasphemous. It's a side-scrolly, very Souls-like style game. And because I don't want to get through everything today, we're going to stop here. I'm going to show the video. Actually, I should probably show the video at the start of class next time so that the other two can see it. I will link the video on Blackboard like I always do. So just take a peek at that if you'd like. It's not as important as the Dark Ages videos, but it's a fun little watch. But yeah, so that'll do it for us today.